as we begin to look specifically at some of the Psalms of degrees. So 3 weeks ago, I guess it was, we did an introduction to the Psalm of degrees and talked somewhat about why that's what they're called. So I don't know how much you remember of that. I know the Michios did not fly up here for the beginning of this series. So we will not go as in-depth, but just a review of some of those things. But the Songs of Degrees, different people had different ideas as to when these particular songs were sung. Some have suggested that, the Jewish men and families would have to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the Passover time, and then the Feast of Pentecost, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. They were to go to Jerusalem. And, if you were from the north or from the south, you still always went up to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is on an elevated place. So you would go up the mountain, so to speak, Mount of Olives, and up in that area. So some believe that they sang this and there was a song of ascent or degrees because people were singing them as they went up to the city of Jerusalem, to the temple. Others have suggested that they sang these songs, perhaps the Levites that sang would sing these as they went up the various steps into the temple. The only problem is there's 15 Psalms of degrees, and there were not necessarily 15 steps up to the temple. Others believe that they sang this as they returned from captivity in Babylon. And any of those things, I guess, could be possibilities. We don't know for sure. I've never read anyone that was certain as to when they were sung. But that doesn't necessarily tell us where they came from and why there were 15 of these things. And so one commentator suggested, and we're going to go on that suggestion, even though we can't be dogmatic about it. It's interesting to look at it in that light, but that they were composed and or arranged by King Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was the king who was about to die, and Isaiah came, said, "You're going to die," and then he prayed, and the Lord gave him more life, extended his life. And he said, "How will I know this is going to happen?" And he said, "What, do you want the sundial to go forward 10 degrees or back 10 degrees?" And so he says, "Go back 10 degrees. So,
what did he have, another 20 years?
15. He had 15 years, and that's why this is very interesting and significant, because when you read the historical account of when that happened, it specifically says that Hezekiah wrote some psalms. And 10 of these 15 Psalms of degrees have no author attached to them. And then there are 4 that are Psalms of David, which obviously was before Hezekiah was king, and also one is a psalm that Solomon wrote. And it's believed, if Hezekiah was responsible for putting these together, it's believed that he wrote 10 psalms because the sundial went back 10 degrees. So that would be 10 of the psalms. The Lord gave him 15 years of life, so he collected some others, and you have 15 psalms in a collection, Psalms of degrees, that commemorate the miracle and the extension of his life. So we're going to, these psalms can be looked at in a different light as well, but we're going to look at them through that particular lens as we not necessarily go through verse by verse, but just examine each of these psalms with that particular idea in mind. And one of the things that makes the Psalms meaningful, even to unbelievers, they like to get into the Psalms when they're going through trials, because these are accounts written by real people who are going through real difficulties or rejoicing in real experiences. So it's not just somebody who wrote a poem about something and it doesn't have any relation, but it has to do with the fact that the psalmist went through an experience. And he wrote that psalm based on that experience he went through, and we can relate to similar kinds of experiences. And, you know, when you know the background of songs, which a psalm is a song, or a hymn, it really adds some meaning to it. And I think I shared this before, but, you know, we read about what a friend we have in Jesus. So many people love it, but not everybody knows the story behind that. And the Joseph Scriven, who wrote those words, the day before he was to get married, his wife tragically was killed in an accident. And then he was single for a long time. Then he fell in love with another woman, and a couple weeks before they were to be married, she got smitten with an illness, and she died. And that was the first one. She fell off a horse and into a stream and I guess broke her neck and drowned. So, so anyway, so you think of that background, and yet it didn't cause him to flee from the Lord. It drove him closer to the Lord, and he penned the words, "What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear." What a privilege. So, you know, that song even takes on more significance because it's a real person who went through a real tragedy, and he really experienced those things, and that's why it relates to our hearts. And if you know the hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul," there were several tragedies in Stafford's life, but he lost his 4 daughters when a ship sank as it was going over the Atlantic. His wife was spared, but his 4 daughters drowned. And so it was when he was traveling later over to Europe to follow his wife, that the ship's captain told him about where it was, that the ship went down. Yeah, I remember that. And when he was at that point, he went to his room, and he said, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say it is well with my soul. So, Psalms are real-life experiences of people who went through them. So we're going to look at Psalm 120 through the lens of Hezekiah. And as we think about Hezekiah when he was in the situation he was, Sennacherib's armies had come down and had surrounded Jerusalem. And the Rabshakeh was out there talking to the men on the wall and saying, you know, surrender to us. And he boasted things like saying, you know, none of the gods of the nations could deliver them from me. Your God is not going to deliver you from me either. Just surrender. And he began to say things like, if you surrender to me, I'll give you houses to dwell in and vineyards, and take you to a land that flows with milk and honey. I don't know if that language sounds familiar, but that's what God told Israel they were going to have if they were obedient. And so he's making these kind of promises, trying to allure them from repelling. Well, here's Hezekiah on a bed somewhere in the castle. He was now out on the wall, but messengers are telling him, you know, these things that are going on. So he's deathly sick, and he's hearing these things about what's going to happen to his kingdom, and that he was going to die. Think about that. And so verse 1, in my distress, I cried to the Lord, and he heard me. And we know, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story, because life was spared. God performed a miracle, and Sennacherib's armies fled, and the city was spared. And so, in my distress, I cried to the Lord, and he heard me. So it's a psalm of testimony that God is a God who answers prayer. Verse 2, deliver my soul, O Lord, from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue. Well, that's what the Rabshakeh was telling. Lies and falsehoods. He says, what shall be given to you, or what shall be done to you, O false tongue? Sharp arrows of the warrior with coals of the broom tree. Those false tongues are going to be destroyed. And they were, through a miracle. Then he says in verse 5, "Woe is me, that I dwell in Meshech, and that I dwell among the tents of Kedar." Now, the person could be dwelling in both places. This is poetry. And I was trying to think of an analogy here, but, sometimes city people are riding around and they'll say, "We're out here in the boondocks." Well, they're not literally in a place called boondocks. But those places that are mentioned here, it says, I'm out there dwelling within my enemies. I'm not even secure from them. They're surrounding me all about. It might be like somebody saying, "Boy, the traffic is like being in Lakewood on a non-Sabbath day." Now, I haven't gone there yet, but somebody told me if I want to go there, go on a Sabbath, because then they're not driving.
We went to Texas Roadhouse. We go the back way through Lake.
Okay.
And that's the only day we'll go
Yeah.
on Saturday.
But,
For that same reason.
in the early days of the ministry of Institute for Creation Research, which is out in California, Ken Ham was associated with them before he left and started his own ministry, and it wasn't a hostile leaving. It was an agreeable thing. They're complementing each other in their ministries. But we were privileged to have Ken Ham and Dr. John Morris come to speak at our school and to speak in our church there. And so Bob Peterson and I went over to Atlantic City Airport to pick them up. And at that time, they were remodeling the airport, so it looked like you just landed in a third world country. And I live out in the country, and it's nighttime. We picked them up, and we're driving there, and Ken Ham says to John in the back, loud enough so we all hear, he says, "For all we know, we've been kidnapped, and who knows where we're going." So, he thought he was out in the wilderness somewhere. So that's the kind of language here. It's just, I'm in a place that is very uncomfortable. Verse 6, "My soul has dwelt too long with one who hates peace." And Sennacherib did not want peace. He wanted to war and he wanted to win. But he says, "I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war." But he recounts that situation. But let's not lose sight of how this psalm began. "In my distress." And that's for any of us. See? "In my distress, I cried to the Lord, and he heard me." Real people going through a real situation that was very difficult. And you and I go through those things. And we can cry to the Lord, and if we know the Lord, we know he's going to hear us. And his means of delivering us is according to his will, but he does do those kind of things and delivers us. So let's be encouraged by this psalm and remember the one upon whom we should call. Because, in my distress, I just worried and worried and worried. In my distress, I complained, the Lord has forgotten me. No, he said, in my distress, I cried to the Lord. That was his resource. And he is the same God today, and he is our resource as well.